we know some facts for sure, and it really is in some ways sort of criminal legal machinations, right? Paul Manafort's going to jail. Now, he may end up getting pardoned at one point, but he's going to jail, and he did have a plea agreement. We know that's fallen apart, and we do know that the Mueller team is going to be filing a sort of almost a shadow report, if you will, in the form of an argument that Manafort broke the plea agreement. We know that something is going on with Jerome Corsi, that he is somehow caught up in the Roger Stone track of the investigation in terms of reaching out to WikiLeaks and getting stolen material from WikiLeaks. It's not like Roger Stone is the Washington Post, right? He can't access this information in the way that maybe the Washington Post could, because they're a clear journalistic outlet. Roger Stone was basically a campaign operative. But there's still another story that came out in The Guardian this week that is one of those things, if true, would be earth-shattering. But that's a big if. Now, The Guardian is a fairly reputable newspaper. I think very reputable, right? I mean, we're not reporting on something that's on a blog that we should know better for, promoting fake news. The sourcing was a little bit thin. There's been broadly some skepticism because many national security reporters knew nothing of this, and they think that they would have. But the story basically was that Paul Manafort visited Julian Assange while Julian Assange was and is holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy in the UK. And starting in 2013. So this is a relationship that predates Manafort's relationship with Donald Trump, or at least I should say as his campaign manager. And some have suggested that, well, if this is true, that relationship would have probably involved Manafort's other clients who were looking for the type of materials that WikiLeaks often came into possession of. But that he had a meeting with Julian Assange at the beginning of March of 2016, which would have been a very significant time. There were no records of him coming into the, no written records in the registry visiting Assange. Supposedly there would be, but the story. The story also mentioned what Manafort was wearing one day, which to me suggests that there was video, but it's unclear who the source was. People don't think that it would have been, British intelligence, which certainly would be surveilling that embassy. It's all very opaque. Quickly, because we got some other things to go through. But what's your take on all this?
Well, it's intriguing. If it's true and it would suggest that this is what they're calling a bridge between Manafort and between the Trump campaign at the very highest level and WikiLeaks, and a direct bridge. This is no degrees of separation between the campaign and the timing, of course. March 2016 was when the hacking was taking place, when Manafort was just coming on to the Trump campaign. He was talking to people like Oleg Deripaska about how can we make ourselves whole. There was a lot of stuff swirling around there. So I'm reserving judgment just like you are. It sounds like it may be too good to be true, but on the other hand, these are all really dumb people. It's like the famous quote from All the President's Men, despite all the myth, these aren't the brightest people. So who knows? From what I gather, the idea is that this probably came from Ecuador, that this came from the Ecuadorian government, which is in its own kind of situation with Assange, and that's where this source was. One of the bylines on the story was located in Ecuador. I don't know, though, so we'll have to wait and see. But if that's true, and I see one thing before we leave this subject, there may be many strands. One thing we know about the Russia investigation is that Russia, by this point, from the press and from what we know of the investigation, the Russians were trying to penetrate the Trump campaign in a dozen different ways. They were meeting, they were calling, had George Papadopoulos, they had, with this guy Misid, we had, Kislyak and Flynn, and, it was coming from all over the place. So we don't know how much of that actually happened. We don't know which ones were directed by the Russian government. We don't know what was successful and who knew and where it went. We don't know any of that. Well, at least not all of it. So, if it's Roger Stone, it could be Roger Stone, it could be Manafort, it could be Trump Jr. and Goldstone and the meeting at Trump Tower. There are a number of different strands to this Russian interference story and conspiracy with the Trump campaign. And we're just starting to see, the good news is that they're at least talking about collusion again instead of concentrating the whole time about obstruction of justice, which is part of it, but it's really beside the point, because the real problem here is that it may be that the President of the United States knowingly conspired with a foreign country to sabotage his rival's campaign, which makes Watergate look like, child's play by comparison.
Okay, so Heather, with that aside, let's take a break here in a moment. When we come back, we got a lot of things to talk about. We want to wrap up the midterm elections and also talk about what Nancy Pelosi faces. There was a caucus vote this week. We also have one new member as of now, and it appears there's only going to be one of the Democratic leadership. Not necessarily the one that I wanted, frankly. We will talk about that as well. And we'll give a little bit of a primer on this Yemen vote that took place this week, where there was an attempt to stop our involvement in Yemen. All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll have more with Digby. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio.